Jeffrey Robinson raised the question about how the humanities and arts relate to each other, and amazingly enough, we're now going to talk about that. So our second panel is Kim Dickey, David Ferris, and Michael Theodore, and I'll turn things over to them.
After Michelle's amazing performance, I feel as though I'm ashamed in a way, because as an artist, I feel as though I really should have, I should serve you all tea out of things I've made, but we didn't have, or made a video especially for this event, but we didn't quite have enough time, so here goes. I am very happy to speak to you about the significance of this small term, as we're speaking about and its relationship to our world, for I've always been a both and rather than an either or kind of gal. It was brought to my attention that this word had a bit more significance today by my kindergartner, who has and as one of her sight words. In her early attempts to learn to read, recognizing and spotting these first words is paramount. And while we were reading, she keeps pointing it out, and then I was assigned this topic for this panel. So I suddenly began to question whether I had really ever given good thought to this conjunction's implications. And isn't it happy then that her first words are the, and is, rather than yet, but, or not, with all their attendant subtle discouragements? For don't we all understand the term and to be inclusive rather than exclusive, addition rather than subtraction, as a plus, essentially? What are seeming oppositions, intelligence and pleasure, male and female, staying up late and getting up early, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, can all be understood by its use as parts to a whole life. And so it is with the arts and humanities. Rather than arguing that one is dependent upon the creation of the other, neither can grow, develop, or be properly defined without the other. I know this to be true within my own Department of Art and Art History. The studio arts could not thrive and progress without attention to its history, to establishing a rigorous critical language and dialogue, and reflecting on methodology, contemporary practice, and theory. These disciplines rely on one another, and as in a good marriage, are challenged by the character and reflections of the other. What the visual arts asks of its audience is to look more closely, to question our perceptions and that of our intentions. In my field, ceramics, raising consciousness about the world around us, the world of objects, and how we as makers help to shape, construct, and affect that environment holds great responsibility. For in the arts and humanities, we are looking at the core of what it means to be human, to be makers and questioners, to be explorers and collectors, to be human in the best sense of the term. As Erwin Panofsky writes in his essay, The History of Art as a Humanistic Discipline, the conception of humanism which has been passed down to us is not, quote, not so much a movement as an attitude defined by the conviction of the dignity of man, based both on the insistence of human values, rationality and freedom, and that can be questions, I'm sure, and the acceptance of human limitations, fallibility and frailty. From this, two postulates result: responsibility and tolerance. At the risk of being too mainstream, and yet for that purpose too, I want to quote from a short statement by Bob Mondello, the wonderful curmudgeon of a film critic on National Public Radio. He was speaking on September 13th, 2001, in support of the Broadway theaters in New York reopening as soon as possible after 9/11. Here is his argument. And I can't really fake his voice, but I'll try. When I was growing up, I saw the theater as a place where I could escape the troubles of the real world. Watching some splashy musical, I forgot my troubles for a couple of hours and those of everyone else. Later, I came to see the theater as a place that could help me understand the real world. Lorraine Hansberry articulated better than I ever could how I felt about family and grace. And in Shakespeare, I found evidence that the problems politicians were grappling with in my own time had always bedeviled leaders. Drama has the advantage of offering closure, and I don't mean that in the sense that evil tends to get punished and good rewarded, because in substantial works it often doesn't. Stage tragedies, though, have form, arising action that leads to a climax, orations that inspire, gestures that find eloquence in movement. If they're well orchestrated in production, they can bring catharsis, a release of emotion that lets us return to a less ordered real world with a feeling that life somehow makes sense, even the world as seemingly unstable as the one I've been walking through this week. I will come to terms with it eventually, as we all will, and I know that one of my strategies for doing so will be the one that I've used all my life, to look for meaning and closure in the stage stories that can offer it when real life cannot, and to find humanity where it resides, even when humans seem inhuman, in art. So our own off-Broadway site, the new Visual Arts Complex, it's off-Broadway, will be the theater for the real-life struggles of our students and professors, artists and historians, and for the staging of works of art in the new CU Art Museum. It's my expectation and hope that its accessibility and centrality will aid us in making what we do within the sight and reach of the campus and beyond, and close to the mission of the university. My questions for this panel are, how do we get beyond preaching to the converted? How do we reach a broader audience effectively? Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to this panel, which, as you notice from the title of it, the word "and" figures prominently in this. Almost to the point that we could say that today the word "and" is what calls us to conversation. And this notion of conversation, I think, is an opposite starting point for us to think about what we do within the arts and humanities. And there is always, since we're humanists, there is always a precedent or a literature about this. And I'd like to go back to 1919 first to discuss what the nature of a conversation was. In fact, a critical discussion of conversation. The remark is from Carl Schmitt, and it's from a work called Political Romanticism. Schmitt writes, "The entire world, the universe, is a conversation. This human community has only the romantic conversation as its content." Let me gloss romantic conversation. For Carl Schmitt, it is subjective and it is occasional. It is when someone responds to an occasional situation, and because there's no kind of logic or history in that situation, what becomes important is that they recognize themselves as an individual or a subject in that occasion. Now, why I want to go back to this moment is to try and raise the question of precisely what is the humanities beyond a simple recognition of a subject convening with the world at a certain occasion. This remark by Schmitt also takes place within a critique of what we recognize as liberal democracy. Schmitt was no friend of liberal democracy precisely because he saw it as neutralizing. And there's a couple of questions I want to pose about the word "and" today, which have to do with arts and sciences, arts and humanities, and also what we now recognize as, sometimes as the savior of the arts and humanities, which is interdisciplinarity. Okay? So I want to look at the conjunctions that these three have quite briefly now. We talk about arts and humanities, and the "and" seems, well, it's pretty good, that "and." Okay, we've got arts and humanities, and they're like one another. So the "and" looks like it's an "and," right? Arts and sciences, oh, we got a bit of a problem here, huh? The arts are here, and the sciences are there. And we have a question of what difference there is that, on the one hand, holds them in some kind of tension with one another, and at the same time puts them in with an institutional structure that we recognize through the Dean's Office, and Todd gracefully also recognized this issue, I think, around his opening remarks as well, that there are arts and there are sciences. And there are different modes of knowledge which are particular to both of these. We, in the arts and humanities, have tended to think about the arts and humanities as being some kind of a common project. And through the years, I think really from the Enlightenment onwards, we have tended to look at ways in which they are brought together, in which they are combined. The most recent of these, at least of what we've called it most recently, is interdisciplinarity. And I would like to pause on this moment and pause on this moment to think about this term, to think about what interdisciplinarity actually may mean. And particularly what it may mean within the arts and humanities. How do we do interdisciplinary work, say within the literature departments, when some of the things that we accept as how we do work in the literature departments is very, very similar, right? How do we do interdisciplinarity within the humanities when we might just be working towards a common goal that we call interdisciplinarity? Is there not a risk here that we may neutralize the differences of the disciplines? Is there not a risk that we may come out with being unable to answer the question, why the humanities? Not why humanity, why the humanities? Now this question we also pose to us, that when we think about arts and humanities, maybe we have to think about more than just a conjunction. But there's more to this than simply a yoking together, which the word "and" suggests to us is taking place. Perhaps in the "and" there is a pull of something else. The pull of the plural. The pull of what is plural and is originally plural. Now why I want to bring this up is to pose the question about what we see as the disciplines within the humanities. How they relate to one another, whether it is right to think of them as a common project, or whether it is right to think about them as specific entities with specific questions to ask which address the humanities rather than reflect the humanities. In other words, within the humanities, is there not a challenge to what the humanities are, and is not that challenge to do with the plural nature of the humanities? Now this challenge that I mentioned to you would seem to suggest that if we think about the humanities as plural, then we have to deal with the difference of the humanities subjects from one another. And I would like just to propose several kind of conclusions to this quite quickly. One is that in that difference of the humanities, there is something critical to the future of the humanities. That there's a critical nature, or critical difference between each of the humanities, which allows questions about what we do as humanists to emerge, rather than putting it together as if, in the sense that Schmidt had said, we could just become subjective and occasional by responding to a situation and thinking, say, okay, in the humanities, we have this moment in which things come together. We might think about it as modernism, where we like to have text and pictures put together in one kind of work, or surrealism, which is why everything can be put together, dreams, everything else, and so on. Even bits from newspapers, you stick in your novel, your surrealist novel. Maybe we need to think about how important, already within the humanities, the question of difference is. How difference articulates the humanities in a plural way, rather than towards some kind of singular project which might be answered by, what is humanity? But you know when you ask this question in undergraduate students, you kind of look at your eyes glaze over and say, what is humanity? Oh dear, what are we going to do now? Maybe we need a challenge. Maybe we need to present the humanities as this challenge. And I would suggest that the most significant way to do this is to think of arts and humanities in the difference of the media which make up the arts and humanities. We can think of music as a certain kind of rhythmic interpretation of the world through a certain harmony and not harmony, right? We can think of theatre and dance as a certain kind of movement in the world. And I would also suggest we need to think about literature as a certain kind of positioning in the world. And it is here that I'd like to argue for the difference between the sciences and the humanities, even though we fall under the rubric of arts and sciences in this university. The arts and the sciences. Is not science a knowledge, a certain knowledge of the world? And is not the arts and humanities a knowledge that is in the world? In the world in a sensible way? In a way that can be touched by the senses? And if this difference can hold, then we have to think about the way in the humanities that the humanities give us to think about our position in the world, rather than abstract something from out of the world. Now it's that difference I want to propose here as being very essential to stopping the neutralization of the humanities. We have to be able to think the position of the arts within the world, or in the world, and what it means to be in that world. And I would argue, and I want to close quickly with two quotations related to this, that to be in the world is to recognize the challenge of what is plural, not what is simply singular, that is represented in the world. For example, we have a concept of what does the world mean, and we go to literature and say, oh look, it's represented in the literature. What have we got? A equals A, maybe A equals B, B equals C, C equals D, maybe we have to account for a differentiation that exists in the world and which the humanities is not a reflection of, but is an expression of the way of being in the world. So I'd like to close very quickly with this by quoting two passages from a work by Jean-Luc Nancy, a French philosopher, from a book called The Muses. First, art does not deal with the world, understood as a simple exteriority, milieu or nature. It deals with being in the world in its very springing forth. It deals with being in the world in its very springing forth. Now for Jean-Luc Nancy, that springing forth is always plural. And if the humanities can preserve that plurality, if that plural which Nancy sees as springing forth with the very way in which we exist in the world, then is not there a particular significance for the humanities, which is beyond representing simply that idea, or another idea, or as Graham pointed out, the dangers of instrumental reason as a means for justifying what it is to be human when one does the humanities. Now to end, I want to do one quick sentences from Jean-Luc Nancy, which kind of takes me back to the beginning of what the "and" actually may mean. This book is entitled The Muses. Not the Muse. The Muses. Nancy writes, "The Muses get their name from a root that indicates ardor, the quick-tempered tension that leaps out in impatience, desire or anger, the sort of tension that aches to know and to do. In a milder version, one speaks of the movements of the spirit. The muse animates, stirs up, excites, arouses. She keeps watch less over the form than over the force. Or more precisely, she keeps watch forcefully over the form. But this force springs up in the plural. It is given from the first in multiple forms. There are muses and not the muse. Their number may have varied, as well as their attributes, but the muses will always have been several. What Nancy presents to us here, the opening of this essay, which is called Why Are There Several Arts, is the challenge of a conjunction which is not a neutralization or unification of the arts under a single idea, but the attempt to preserve a critical difference that the humanities and the arts themselves share, and also to think about this sharing as also what keeps us in a certain way separate from one another. We do not talk about music in terms of art, we do not use art to talk about terms of music, and we might do some poetry to talk about art and music, but nonetheless, there's a difference between language, there's a difference between music, their modalities, and there's also a difference between movement of theatre, but it's the movement of the body through and across space. This differences marks our presence as plural. Each media has a different way of being in the world. And it is that difference which opens up the significance, I would argue, of what it is not only to be human in this case, but what it is to be in the humanities in the world. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to start by saying thank you, Jeff. And when I say thank you, what I really mean is, I'm just picturing getting that email where you said, do a provocative statement about what does the "and" mean. And thank you, Jeff. Really what I was thinking. And in fact, it was pretty challenging. I drew many, many blanks. And so I started thinking to myself, maybe I could have a glass of water. Maybe I could talk really fast like Spalding Gray and talk about getting a blank. Would that be provocative? Or I could talk about getting arrested at the Museum of Modern Art because I was taking pictures when I wasn't supposed to. That wasn't true, but maybe that'd be provocative or something. And so I realized that that would only get me about as far as I've just gotten. So I started thinking to myself, well, what is the most provocative thing that I've heard about the humanities in public recently? And wow, I thought that talking about this was going to be a little bit like talking about sort of unwanted body hair, you know. But in fact, following Graham, and remind me please never to follow a philosopher, in fact, everything that I was going to talk about, he already talked about. And what was the technical term? It was the instrumental argument? Mm-hmm. Yes, which I think would be a great name for a rock band, especially if they have vocals, because it'd be sort of postmodern, ironic thing. Anyway, I started thinking to myself, okay, back to what was the most provocative thing that I heard. Now, a fellow named Stanley Fish, you've probably heard of him. He's got some very stellar humanist credentials, I'd say. I mean, he was a medievalist, after all. And he wrote in a, you know, little rag, you might have heard of it, newspaper, it's New York's newspaper of record, the New York Times. He had a little blog, cute little blog entry called, "Will the Humanities Save Us?" And to cut to the chase, he said no. And his argument essentially was the one that I thought I was going to sort of have things thrown at me for even mentioning, but I'm glad that Graham sort of already did it. He was saying that, well, not only did he say that no, the humanities won't save us, but he also said that, are the humanities of use? No, they're literally of no use. And so, of course he didn't mean that, so what did he mean? And I think what he was saying was, well, we shouldn't argue based on this utilitarian rationale. And so I'm deliberately sort of not coming down on either side of this question. That's the provocative part. But I will say that I don't think he was saying that they're literally of no use. He's saying, well, look, do we really want to measure ourselves as artists and humanists by this idea that, you know, reading literature or reading philosopher, we become not only wise but also good? You know, by that, if we believe that, then basically all philosophers would be good people, right? Like Socrates, he'd be a good guy, despite all the things you might have read about him drinking everyone else under the table and all that. Or you might, you know, say, well, here's why we should do music, because music, it really helps our kids do math, right? So we're going to save the children. We're going to save the children from having trouble with their math homework. That's why we should do music. And this is really, I think, he does have a good point in that it's if we start to go down that road, man, it is tough. It's really tough, because then you start to think, well, okay, I have a new paper on, say, you know, a new reading of Sexual Metaphor in Ovid or whatever. And I'm going to put that up against utilitarian advances in alternative energy as far as their rationale and justification to society. It's tough to argue with the people that hold the purse strings there. So anyway, back to the provocative question. So is the "and", that important "and" that unites humanities and the arts, the fact that these are areas of academia which must be justified without appealing to some kind of utilitarian rationale, without appealing to a direct practical outcome, and finally, without appealing, therefore, to that which can easily be translated into financial figures. I just suggested a topic, so you discuss. Body hair always kills the discussion.
Well, I think because I was raising my hand since no one else was, you should.
Oh, well, I was just going to ask David. I think you dealt head on with this "and", but you are in a department that is called Humanities. So, how do you position yourself in terms of what you said to us?
Within what I mentioned as the notion of plural, we do music, we teach art, we teach literature, and what I think I agree all of us do is that we don't teach them as representations of one of the other. But what we should look at in some way, in many ways, is to try and preserve the differences of each of those media. Because, you know, if we talk about, say, music is a certain kind of relationship, a certain kind of thinking about the world in some way, which uses sound as its articulation. But there's something specific about music which makes it still able to do that kind of reflection. And if we were to then say, okay, you know, dance and movement is another way of doing that, then we run danger if we try to unify them under one idea or one concept, right? So that what we're teaching our students simply is that there's not a pluralism, there's not a plural thinking, there's a unitary thinking under which all the arts can be grouped as one idea, right? There's one purpose or one common project to the arts, and that in many ways is an extension of a rational enlightenment kind of project. But there's a rational idea which says that this is what the arts are, and that saves the arts. What happens if it's not that, right? What happens if there's something plural, as Nancy argues, about the arts from the very, very beginning, and that we're caught up in a critical project to try and unite or unify the arts in order to give them some kind of significance, because we have this other, pressures, ideological and political and otherwise, in order to justify ourselves in those terms. What happens if our notion of the plural within the humanities, in fact, it's more politically astute than the kind of notion that we're given by politics to explain what we are and what we do? Yeah? And that's a critical challenge. And it's up to us to carry that critical challenge, I think, rather than to think about, okay, what's the most simply, what's the most effective fallback to just justify the humanities? I think Ren mentioned it, right? Okay, we can teach you critical thinking, and we teach you critical thinking. You can go to, you can do anything, can't you?
Yeah, I can appreciate more the distinction you're making then, because I think within the academy maybe we do what you're asking for, but as we present ourselves to others, we may for political reasons think that's good.
Yeah.
But why not have just one large department called the humanities? Since you're doing it the way it should be done.
Yeah. Well, I would think that we do it with a certain kind of intervention into humanities, which also preserves the differences within the humanities. And without those differences, I mean, we will try to bring them into a critical relationship with one another, which sometimes doesn't always happen, because disciplines frequently end up having a certain kind of logic which decides what questions can be asked within them. For example, and that's how disciplines found themselves, by a certain kind of questioning towards a certain kind of object. And within the humanities, what I think is so interesting about what we can do in the Department of Humanities is that we are not bound to that model of knowledge. So we can actually bring a certain antagonism between the disciplines within what we do within the humanities. And also avoid at that same time the simple kind of neutralization under an idea that humanities are only about one thing, blah, 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 which in the end, I think everybody finds it's very unsatisfactory. Well, it's unsatisfactory. But we always feel that we're missing something critical when we subsume the humanities under a single idea or a single telos, which is the project of the humanities. I tried to use Nancy to bring this across, is that what if the project of the humanities was plural from the very beginning? So that the very notion of what it is simply, it's not about humanity, it's about humanities, right? And therefore, we should not subsume it under a single idea. And we should try and preserve what it is to be plural, because that plural is the challenge of humanities. It's Beth and then...
Well, I think that when we think of arts and sciences, those echoes of those words are really very different from the disassociation that's being created now and that we in the arts and humanities probably project onto the sciences. So if you take the word technology with its ancient Greek root of techne, which means to craft, you could find the sciences and the arts together. You could find it in very concrete, real ways, such as glaze chemistry and photochemical chemistry. And you could find it in architectural structure. And I think that we should inflect a deeper meaning into the word science as well as into the arts. And that, of course, the origin of that term for our whole college is very different from the way that from the way that we think of the arts, and then we're trying to break that down right now, and also the way that we think of the sciences problematically now. So, and then the social in all of that, because there is social sciences. I think the first academic paper I ever gave, Stanley Fish was the keynote speaker, and my argument was that the artist as anthropologist. So the idea of James Clifford, the artist as the interlocutor, as the travel writer, as the recorder, and as creating the bridges between periods of history and between cultures. So one could also think of the artist as a historian. I mean, Kim Dickey probably teaches extremely detailed ceramics history. I'm sure you do. I, as a student, learned as much art history from my studio faculty as I did from my art history professor. So these are just examples that a lot of this is probably already happening. Some of this, what you're talking about, this positive.
I would like, I'd like to support that in the term interdisciplinarity is something that keeps coming up, and I think that we are actually working in interdisciplinary ways all the time within our fields, and even in the nature of our department. And so it's so natural to the way in which we think and work already. It's a matter, I feel, is of bringing a sort of enlightenment to what we do, to a greater public, to understand that existent practice, but also to speak to the muses. Also, and I know this certainly within my field, we look outside our fields for inspiration. It's something that is, and from many, many different disciplines for inspiration, so that when one is in a creative mode, you're reinventing. There's more freedom for creativity if you're not looking directly at the history of what your discipline is, but looking at science, botany. The history of cuisine, any number of things to draw and reinvent your tradition. And I think the other thing is that we also we have very, very separate disciplines within our department. There's constantly a conversation about which ones we sort of pool, because there's certainly similar engagement of ideas and so on going on, in structures and shared resources and any number of things. But there are conceptual frameworks that are in which we are asking a very specific question within each of those disciplines. That's a very deep and rich question. And so there's something to be supported there. That structure makes sense intellectually, conceptually, as well as physically. So I'm always a little wary of the idea of dissolving those frameworks, because they have meaning.
I think you may have answered my question, Kent, but this is initially addressed to David about interdisciplinarity. I just wanted to press that a little further and to consider what we are doing when we're doing interdisciplinary team teaching. There's a lot of talk on this campus about interdisciplinarity. There's not much in the way of resources for the actual enactment of interdisciplinary teaching, but is, David, following up some of the things you say, is the purpose of interdisciplinary teaching to kind of articulate the different position we have in relationship to a body of knowledge, or does that activity actually generate new questions, do you think?
I think it generates new questions if it's done well. If it's done badly, it neutralizes the possibility of any kind of new question. Well, I'd say new question, but let me gloss that very, very quickly. My take on this is that when one considers a history of interdisciplinarity, one can trace it back into the Enlightenment, right, to a certain project of rationality, which tries to, think about the encyclopedic project, okay, coming out of the 18th century. If that project has to do with a certain thinking of rationality of the organization of knowledge, then it is thinking about the relationships between the knowledge with a certain kind of project which affirms rationality at an end point. My question would be that whether interdisciplinarity, done in a very rigorous way, does not question that kind of a project, does not question that kind of a rational project, so that it raises a question of the differences between ways of knowing. And I want to go back to the previous remark about techne, right? In this case, the techne in the Greek sense it describes a specific way of knowing, right? So that our sense of what technology is, in some ways, has got lost from this history, it's got severed itself from this history. But if techne is a certain way of knowing the world, right? And then we discipline that way of knowing the world, then we kind of control what kind of knowledge is possible in relationship to the world through the techniques that we adopt in order to understand it. Now, I think what interdisciplinarity can do when it's done well is to make us see the history of that narrowing, okay, of that disciplining. Now, that does not necessarily mean that interdisciplinarity then goes in to be a body of knowledge of itself. I see interdisciplinarity rather as a critical intervention in the fields of the disciplines which already exist. But it is an awareness of what's going on within those fields, and I would hesitate to produce it as an end in its own right, because then I think simply what one has done has reaffirmed the Enlightenment project and its instrumental reason.
Yeah, and I guess the problem that I have with it, having experimented with it myself fairly recently, is that it is difficult to simultaneously train students in the contours of a particular discipline and also dismantle that or raise new questions about it or cast new light on those disciplines at the same time. You do run the risk of a kind of dilettantism or incoherence for
or
students.
Appropriation. Or simply appropriation of one discipline for another. I mean, I'll give you an example. If you go back into the Enlightenment, and figures such as Diderot, who it's two texts by Diderot which kind of elaborate this problem. One is called A Letter on the Blind for the use of those who can see. Right? So what's the issue here? How do you see how someone doesn't see? Right? And he poses a question right in those texts about what is the difference between how does the blind person have a knowledge of the world which is essentially visual, right? How is that knowledge communicable to someone who actually sees? The person who sees cannot see how the blind person doesn't see, right? So you already have a disconnect. I mean, and this is the Enlightenment figure, right? You already have a disconnect within the rationality of interrelation, within the, even just not the humanities, but the way that knowledge is in the world at the very moment that the Enlightenment is supposedly putting this together in these cliches which we inherit, right? So that the whole question of what is related from one discipline to another, I think you can put into that moment, right? Of a blind person relating to the visual person, right? How do the blind see, right? And they see by displacement into another area, right? Which is touch in this case, right? And Nancy makes the argument that touch and sense is the way that we exist in the world. But the visual has taken a certain hegemony over that, a certain priority over that, so that what we now do is instead of being in the world, right, touching the world, sensing the world, we displace it into perception, which is how the eyes do it. And once we get into perception, we get a certain perspective. Once we get into a certain perspective, we have a certain technique, a certain way of seeing, which then controls how we are in the world.
I know that there are lots of people that want to talk. I just wanted to jump in on that really quickly and just speak about a sort of countervailing, perhaps, tendency that I'm also aware of. And I'm thinking in particular of my experience. I've been co-teaching with Michelle, our first speaker, a class called Interdisciplinary Performance for about almost 10 years, maybe. And one of the things that's fascinating to me about that, and be interested to hear what you think as well, is you hear this buzzword a lot, convergence, when talking about sort of things digital. And that's been a real specific instance of convergence appearing before our eyes in this sense. We work with artists from all around the different areas of campus, And we work with technology a lot in this class. And so we're working with images, we're working with sound, we're working with controlling hardware using sensors and things like this. And one of the things that's emerging from that is once you sort of go into this realm of talking about signals, interacting with other signals, and especially once you make that leap into representing those signals as zeros and ones, there's a sort of, you get this for free level of synergy and interactivity amongst people who don't even speak the same lingo. That's just fascinating to observe. And so while I think it's important to really do our due diligence by our disciplines and maintain rigor in our study of our individual disciplines, I think that there are certain trends, especially driven by technology perhaps, that are leading towards this overused word of convergence. So.
Can I just say one quick thing about just what you said made me think about this. The quotation I began with from Schmidt was, the entire world, the universe is a conversation. We could easily rewrite that and say the entire world, the universe is interdisciplinary. Right? And what do you get then? I mean, it's a neutralization of the world. Right? So if there is in fact no other world other than a world which is just everything's equal to everything else. And I think the question that interdisciplinarity can bring out if it's done well is the question of the difference of the way things are in the world, the way disciplines are in the world. And it's very easy to end up risking turning one thing into another, into another, into another, into another. And then we have, I guess, neither content nor knowledge. Huh? Yeah, just displacement.
Pardon me for reading this, but my area requires a little basic perspective. So, if I might. The image, sound, the object, or the word, whether it be spoken, heard, felt, or seen, establishes our existence. The words, or these images, save us because they identify us to the other. The existence of the arts and the humanities requires our individual existence. There is no evidence of our existence without them. Thus, we are saved by their existence. Thus, Hamlet's question is somewhat ironic because in saying to be or not to be, he established his own basic existence and his purpose. The stored record of the arts and the humanities, or anything that is a record of science or humanities, thus becomes the foundation that we exist in our status. The instruction of those areas helps us to explain to ourselves and to others who we are and what we are becoming.
Do you want us to comment on that, or is there a question?
No, we're just getting comments from the audience. We don't respond.
I'm trying to wrap my arms around the subject. I hear the terms arts and science and humanities and science almost interchangeably.
Arts and humanities?
In fact, it seems like what I'm grappling with, it seems like you're talking about essentially a plumber with different tools in approaching humanities or science questions as opposed to arts questions. And they have an appropriate distinct category, much as in philosophy, the difference between epistemology and metaphysics. And that is to describe, how sex takes place, or what is involved in sexual behavior is different than having sex. It's the same difference as where Buddhism brings a notion of how we experience the world, as opposed to an emphasis on ethics and values. I think there's a lot of interesting distinctions, but I think what art brings to our humanity are those things that we associate with creativity and enhancement of the beauty of life and beauty itself, which doesn't have the kind of objective criteria that science and humanities seem to strive for. That is, that they each want to objectify their disciplines and suggest that we are, that we legitimize ourselves by being objective and having verifiable criteria, where arts doesn't have that as a tool for measuring good art from bad art. It's more has to do with how we are engaged as human beings in the creative experience. And so I guess that's kind of my best take on what you're saying. I'm just trying to put it together and get your feedback.
I would be careful about one thing here, and that's an argument which turns upon the beautiful as a justification, or only turns upon the beautiful as a justification. I mean, there's a whole history to this, and I'd very quickly just give one moment from it from 1936, in a text by Walter Benjamin, in which he talks about the uses that, the ability of fascism to aestheticize politics. In other words, to produce politics in an aesthetic image, which then becomes a means of political instrumental use. Okay? So that there's something about a history, or just simply the beautiful, which also needs to be put into a critical context, I think. And I think that's what the humanities are for. It's to develop that critical context. It's to understand what it means both politically, socially, and artistically. And the whole question of art then, I think, evolves from why is it that we have art at all, right? And why is it, and to go back to my question from Nancy, why is it that there are different arts? And why is it that what we call art changes? Because it does not remain the same through history. Okay? There's a different essence of art for different periods. And if we have that, then there's no kind of sense of that transcendent art or transcendent beautiful we can always refer to and say, well, that's where we want to be. The question is more historical in that case, I think.
But you're still agreeing with me that even by changing, giving more flesh to the definition of art, that it's a different toolbox you're operating in than the toolbox you answer humanities and science questions.
I think there's a specificity to the toolbox that the humanities has, which is different from one that the sciences has. And I tried to explain that by making the brief remark about the sciences toolbox is oriented towards an understanding of the world, right? Whereas our understanding is what it means to be in the world, right? Because art, in that sense, a different sense of the aesthetic perhaps, but art, there's a certain sense, right, touch, sensibility about the aesthetic, okay? Which means that it's something which is experienced as being in the world rather than something which is abstracted from the world. And we will lose the significance of the arts and humanities if we follow the scientific model and simply adopt it as an understanding of the world. Then it just simply becomes a representational game in which we have an idea or concept and we say, that's what art represents in the world. And I think then the significance is gone of what we do.
I think we're on the same page. I mean, the metaphor about sex was intended to do just what you're saying, that describing sex is different than doing it.
We'll take one more comment, then we'll take our break.
I can't help but think that Michael sort of left us with this challenge that's sort of like the elephant in the room. Nobody's really talking about it, whether or not we need to justify what we do in the humanities and the arts. And I was thinking about everything that Michael said and the idea that the things we choose to teach actually do have practical, they affect people in many different ways. If you choose a certain piece of music to play, if the symphony plays music, it has financial implications with the composer. The literature that we choose to teach in some ways represents our values to our students. So are there responsibilities that we need to consider as educators that do have those kinds of considerations?
Thank you. Always good to hear these conversations come back to what we do in teaching as well. So, another great panel. We obviously hoped that the and in arts and humanities was, as Kim said, a plus. And I think we've learned a lot about that plus from our panelists. I mean, I do think we've ended up talking mainly about interdisciplinarity. And since I'm an evil administrator and live in the world where they talk about these things, interdisciplinarity often strikes me like the word excellence. It doesn't really mean anything. It's just something we're always striving for. But we think we do need to remember that interdisciplinarity can be used in a singular against the disciplines. But I think instead we need to be arguing for different versions of interdisciplinarity. There are interdisciplinarities. The kind of collective, collaborative work that Michael was talking about is different than trying to smash disciplines together. Work on a common project that may bring together people from different disciplines who remain in their own disciplines but are trying to solve a common problem is a different model again. And I think that there may be models of interdisciplinarity within the arts and humanities. There are inherently interdisciplinary disciplines like classics that already use a range of disciplines to understand their subject matter. But it's a rich subject for us to be thinking about this year, particularly because it is a term that evil administrators use.